climate poses the greatest risk to the contemporary nation state as a political form that it's ever faced, and that's only going to get worse. So we can't really imagine something not changing. That may be the strengthening of existing states in a pretty scary way, or it might mean coordination that we had never imagined between China and the US because they're the most powerful states in the world. Who knows?
Geoff Mann, welcome to The Breakdown. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to get started with a kind of bigger question, so I apologize for opening up with something a little more abstract. But one of the things I think that came through for me in reading a lot of your work is references a lot to the idea that the kind of moment that we're facing may not be as exceptional as we think it is. So you reference Hobbes' Leviathan, of course, where he was sort of fixated with the idea of an impending civil war, or you open a recent essay in the LRB with a quote from Hannah Arendt, who is, of course, thinking about the threat of, nuclear fallout. So what, I guess, is your sort of motivation for drawing on those kinds of references in thinking about the politics of our moment? And is there anything you think, any sort of qualities of climate change in particular that might make it exceptional or a sort of unique political challenge?
I think that we are in an exceptional moment. Actually, I would say, though almost reluctantly, that this time really is different. I know that not everyone thinks that, and part of what I'm trying to do is check my own sense that that's true, because I really feel like that can feel quite helpless, that sense. And so I do think it's important to remember to look around, to look back, to look around. That we do have tools, collective and otherwise, intellectual, political, technical perhaps, that can help us with this moment. But I am really aware of the fact that at least my gut instinct is that this moment really is quite different. And I'm concerned that we've hit a place where it feels, this may not be the truth, but it feels to a lot of people, myself included, like the past isn't a very good lesson for the futures that we may or may not be heading into. And I think that's a really unsettling, kind of gravity-defying sense. And that would be my diagnosis of contemporary climate politics at a most general level. I don't mean amongst radical activists necessarily, but I just, people who are generally aware of the problem, are concerned, are unclear what to do, and really feel a little bit like looking back isn't very helpful right now.
Right. And so is that what sort of led you to your current work, which is focused on this idea of uncertainty and the kind of radical uncertainty that is posed by the climate crisis? I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the way you're thinking about uncertainty and its importance to understanding this challenge, both in the kind of abstract sense, but also in concrete terms. How does that play out in climate or economic models, and what are the problems there?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of what I think I've discovered in this process is that when I speak to climate scientists in particular, this isn't necessarily as true of economists, though I don't want to generalize at all. But the climate scientists are so aware of the uncertainties of their models that it's almost hilarious how little of that uncertainty gets reflected in the way that it gets reported or we learn about their conceptions of the future. Every climate scientist, almost the first thing they raise is the kinds of uncertainties inside their models. The problem, I think, is they are probably a little bit cautious, and I am too, because when we talk about uncertainty in the climate models, for example, people generally tend to assume that the uncertainty lies on both sides of the modeling problem, and it doesn't. We are sure climate change is real, it's accelerating, it's faster than we expected, all of these other things. What we don't know is how fast, or even if we knew how fast, the ways in which the processes themselves will unfold. So for example, I was talking to this fantastic glaciologist from the University of Texas just last week, and I was saying to her, what are the biggest uncertainties in your model? And she said, well, we know that with carbon concentrations in the atmosphere considerably less than at present, in the last interglacial period, the ocean was 9 meters higher than it is now. So, as far as she's concerned, we should expect at least 9 meters of sea level rise. The problem is we don't know how fast that'll happen. Right now it's millimeters a year, but that can't be the case forever. She said, because we don't have any science, we actually don't know what it looks like for a whole ice sheet to collapse. So it's these are the sort of monumental uncertainties. As I know you know this, but it's not like whether or not things are going to get warm. It's like
How warm, how fast. How severe.
and the other thing she was saying is that what you don't think about very often, but is actually true, is that sea level rise is a really localized phenomenon. It's not like a bathtub. It has geography and all these other things make a huge difference. So anyway, this is all an example to say that the scientists are very aware of the uncertainties in their models, and what I'm interested in is both how they deal with those from a technical perspective, but also how they think about the political and policy implications of communicating that knowledge. And I'm also interested in how they kind of live with it themselves, because it's not an easy thing to study potential calamity all day, every day, as you would know as well as anyone else. And so I'm interested in that form of uncertainty. I'm also interested in the kind of ways that things get taken up by politicians, even well-meaning ones. I'm actually most interested in well-meaning ones because, no one needs to tell me that Trump is a disaster on the climate front. I don't need to write a chapter on that. And then I'm also most interested in the political / cultural realms in which the rest of us try to figure out how to organize or even just live in the face of not ignorance, but actual real, like, gut-wrenching uncertainty, which I think really characterizes a lot of people's conception of what the future will look like even 15 or 20 years down the line. And I do think that is unprecedented.
I think the point about focusing on well-meaning actors is, I think, an important one, because obviously I think they're much more interesting than, a bad faith actor. It's not really something that you can sort of engage with. And I find that not only with science, but also in the economic sphere in particular. I mean, we all like to kind of vilify a William Nordhaus type figure, which I have done many times, not least because he's, I guess, quite visible as a sort of Nobel Prize-winning economist. And a lot of that comes down to the way that he thinks about uncertainty, I guess. But at the end of the day, he is trying to integrate climate into economic models in a way that was, I guess, unprecedented. So I think there's a lot there. I'd love to know, I guess, have you been engaging with the way that economic thought is grappling with uncertainty? Is that something that you think is, I guess, a fundamental limitation or something that is easily, I guess, overcome?
I have been thinking a lot about that. And I would also say that it is not at all easily overcome. Again, I would say that the economists that you and I would be excited to have a chance to talk to or eager to read are all very aware of the uncertainties in their models. So much so that many of them use models more as kind of heuristics or helpful tools rather than predictive systems or a way to produce precision that would be otherwise unrealizable. I think that's not how those folks think, because they know that's actually not how the world unfolds. And they are very concerned with uncertainty in their models. But in general, as you know probably as well as anyone else, the modeling process itself constrains how uncertainty can be understood. So what you might think of as radical or fundamental uncertainties, let alone existential or what you might, I guess we could call it futurological uncertainty, those kinds of things, they can't be incorporated in a model. So I'm sure somebody would tell me that's not true, but they can't be incorporated in a model I'll ever pay attention to. So for example, the vast majority of climate models, whether we like it or not, effectively either, if they're scientific, stick to the science, or if they're climate economy models, they generally assume, for example, without stating, the general persistence of the most fundamental institutions of modern liberal capitalism. So if we, knowing what we know, think those are actually be at risk over the next few decades, then our understanding of how the economy might operate is a totally different, and you start to kind of fizz out at the end of the model. And I am really interested more in that, the breakdown of that kind of analytic thinking at that moment when you hit a future that you can't really understand anymore. And I'm most interested in, not because I think we should try to make it more certain. I think we have to live with that uncertainty. Even if, as you know, we stop emitting now, we're looking at the kinds of changes in the climate and Earth system that will require there's a lot of change coming, whether we like it or not. And I don't think trying to produce certainty at this moment is kind of the right goal. I think we need to learn to live collectively with the uncertainties that we're facing and somehow work on a politics of expectation that sees a world unfolding in potentially volatile ways, but one in which we trust each other. We build a collective expectation that we won't turn on each other, which I think is actually the common sense right now.
Right. Actually brings me very naturally to my next question, which is based, I guess, on your 2019 book, Climate Leviathan, in which you sort of sketch different kind of planetary political futures, your own kind of political modeling, if you will. But I think under the basis of the idea that you've just talked about there, which is maybe that our political systems or our sort of politics in a more abstract sense are ill-equipped to grapple with this kind of uncertainty or the scale, I guess, and complexity of the challenge we're facing. So it'd be great if you could sketch out a little bit some of the sort of the core futures that you envision and imagine as the most likely. And I guess explain a little bit in concrete terms how you sort of settled on those as the kind of four alternatives. They've all got great names: Leviathan, Mao, Behemoth, and then the very mysterious X, which we can come to at the end, I guess the most optimistic. So maybe let's start with the first three, and just kind of walk us through your thinking on these three different kind of futures.
Right. So the first thing I would want to flag, not surprising to you, is that this work was all done with Joel Wainwright. So I certainly, every idea is probably more his than mine, but we worked together on it the whole time, and it was a lot of years together working on it. And so the model, which, as you mentioned, is it ends up in a kind of ugly 2x2 table. And on one end, we have capitalist and not capitalist. That's the spectrum. It's oversimplified, obviously. And the other axis, we have sort of planetary sovereign. In other words, climate change is pushing us to sort of a planetary scale government, to non-sovereign or at least non-planetary sovereign. And so it produces this 2x2 table, as I mentioned, where we have squares that represent a sort of capitalist future with a planetary-like sovereign, which isn't to say a world government, but some sort of coordination of existing power structures that enable us to govern the global climate.
Yeah.
A square that is capitalist but very much against any kind of planetary level coordination. A square that is anti-capitalist but pro-coordinating, or at least authority enough to help govern the climate. And then a final one, which is the one you mentioned is the most hopeful, this climate X, which is both opposed to a kind of sovereign rule, but also anti-capitalist. Because Joel and I would both say that we would, I think I can speak for him, I should be careful too, but I think I can speak for him by saying that I think we would both isolate capitalism as the most important cause of the climate problem being a very understated word. And so that's the four. And we make the argument, again, I think we'd be very careful not to say these are systematic, this is going to happen, we're just heading down A, B, C, or D. These were ways of thinking. But we do believe that climate poses the greatest risk to the contemporary nation state as a political form that it's ever faced, ever. And that's only going to get worse. So we can't really imagine something not changing. That may be the strengthening of existing states in what we'd probably consider a pretty scary way, or it might mean coordination that we had never imagined between China and the US because they're the most powerful states in the world, who knows? But we argue that the most likely, because it is incumbent in the sense, is what we call climate Leviathan, the top left corner. So both a world coordination, planetary sovereign type of thing based in the capitalist mode of organizing our economies and political economies. And we say it's the most likely partly because, as I said, it's incumbent, it's the people in power. We also understand it as being a kind of logical growth out of people who want to keep existing power structures the way they are. It will, the way we imagine it is it'll keep the people who are running the show still running the show, but they'll be coordinating globally or enforcing their power globally. The one below it we call climate Mao, which is of course quite strident, but the argument is that it would be the fundamental argument actually is that the vast, maybe not the vast majority, but a huge proportion of the people who are most at risk of climate change are in Asia, with political traditions very different than our own in North America, with revolutionary political traditions more recent and very different than our own. And we can't really imagine the world going into flames without those people choosing to exercise some of their constituent power. Those traditions, we imagine, like Maoism, will be probably a very important part of how they organize, or at least this is our guess, and the kinds of movements and political communities they build.
Yeah. And could you just, for the benefit of everyone, explain what sort of a Maoist system would look like?
Well, the system itself, I think I would be very reluctant to try to describe, but the mode of organizing is it doesn't rely on the kind of classic Marxist model of an largely urban proletariat or whatever. It's a very much a rurally, or at least not necessarily urban, peasant-based revolutionary subject, collective revolutionary subject, which would characterize a great deal of Asia, not all, of course, by any means. And would also, confront the kinds of limits of some of the existing nation states. There have been Maoist movements, as you know, ongoing ever since Mao himself throughout Southeast Asia, in India itself, in China, Nepal, all sorts of other. So it's clearly, we might think of it as a political ideology / approach that can travel and has traveled widely. So that's the one that we could, because China also has, to the extent that it is the hegemon in that region. India obviously wouldn't be necessarily happy with me phrasing it that way, but regardless, we do also see aspirations for a more global exercise of power on the part of China in particular right now, but not only, in Africa, elsewhere in the world, Latin America. So this is the opposition. It's not very well fleshed out, but one of the interesting things about Climate Mao is how excited so many people are when we talk about it, which neither Joel and I ever anticipated. Like, we have spoken to a lot of audiences of leftists who are like, we need a Climate Mao. That sounds like a good idea. And Joel and I were like, wow, we never really thought of it as a good idea, but we do see it as a possibility in the vaguest way. The top right corner, which is capitalist and very much anti any kind of globalist coordination, we call climate, as you mentioned, climate behemoth. And climate behemoth, it's a caricature, but we wrote the book before Trump.
Right.
But Trump pretty much captures exactly what we had in mind.
Sure.
And we do see it as a very worrying direction, and it's clearly not the only place. The United States is not the only place it's played out. Brazil, Hungary, other places. Arguably India, to an extent right now. But we also don't see it as like a long-term, we just can't imagine a world 4 degrees hotter in which that kind of attitude toward climate change can persist. It just doesn't seem like a long-term strategy. But it does seem very appealing to particular elites and their broader support base than we probably ever imagined. When we wrote the book, it was a little bit of, we were caricaturing what we thought of as Sarah Palin, and who now seems a little bit like a mild version.
Yeah.
And then the final block, as you mentioned, is what we call Climate X. We call it Climate X partly because we don't really know what's going to fit in it.
Yeah.
I do think that if Joel and I described Climate X right now, we might say different things, whereas with the other three, we were pretty solid. Not that we disagreed. I think it's just a different set of anticipated politics. I don't think Joel would disagree if I said to you, which is what I believe, that it won't be any one thing. It'll be a very diverse set of local or regional responses to the particular ways in which the challenges that climate change poses, both ecological, but also more importantly, in some ways, political, how people respond in their place and time with the constraints and opportunities and resources and cultural histories and all of the rest of it that they have at hand. And so it's going to be a collection of movements, and I think, and some of them will be nation state based probably, but many of them won't be, I would expect. And I think that the political commitment to it involves a sense of solidarity in those movements, in the sense of trusting local people to know it. My at least vision for the revolutionary politics that might be associated with something called Climate X do not come with a set of dogmatic or doctrinaire approaches to popular liberation or emancipation or anything like that. I would expect and really hope that those of us who might be fortunate enough to be involved in that politics would be a nurturing environment in which different kinds of solutions find fertile soil.
And do you see any kind of tension or trade-off, I guess, between that kind of more disaggregated kind of collection of political power, I suppose, an exercise of it, and the kind of question of what is an incredibly complex coordination problem in a way of, decarbonizing the global energy system, for example. Do you see that as a tension, or do you see that as something that can be sort of reconciled fairly naturally in terms of just the scale of kind of global coordination that a lot of people would argue is required?
No, I agree that it's a big problem. And I guess I would also say, maybe, I'm not sure if this is ducking the question or not. If it is, I apologize. But I do think that there's a tension there, absolutely. But I think it's one that we're going to have to live with. I just do not personally, I don't have any greater foresight than anyone else, but I do not personally anticipate us having access to some version of a progressive global coordinating system anytime close to when we'll need one. That might be a long-term goal, but I think we're going to have to work without one. It would obviously be ideal to have one, but I think these movements or political institutions or whatever they become are going to be, at least at first, operating in a world without that. Not ideal, but
yeah. So you describe, I guess, where we are. The closest thing would be the kind of climate Leviathan state. Definitely sort of a liberal capitalist hegemony, helmed by, I guess, the US within international institutions like, the UNFCCC might be an example of something approaching a kind of global coordinating power, or sovereign as you describe it, although it doesn't have, you might argue, much sovereignty in a way.
Or any,
or any,
Yeah.
Lamentably. But I'd be interested to know, I guess, so the book came out in 2019. Obviously, a lot can happen in 5 years, 5-ish. And I want to talk about Bionomics, to use that word, or I guess the policies of the Biden administration, which a lot of people have argued and would stand by, have been in many ways a huge rupture with, particularly in the US, how climate politics have looked like up until sort of the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted. But in many ways, it seems to align perfectly still with this kind of climate Leviathan concept, I suppose. So it'd be great to know, I guess, how do you see the essentials of Bionomics? If you had to define it, how would you try to capture its essence? And how does it fit, I guess, into this picture? Is it sort of an extension to keep sort of climate Leviathan on life support a bit longer, or do you think it has a kind of durability that might sort of extend the life of that project?
Right. Well, I guess I would want to make 2 points, at least. The first is that, and again, I can't speak for Joel, but I'm not sure that what has unfolded in the 4 to 6 years since the book came out, I'm not sure if we anticipated it very exactly, if that makes any sense. I do think that the sort of liberal, at least popular desire for something like a climate Leviathan that can kind of keep everything the same but save us from climate change I think that was a really accurate diagnosis, and I think that still holds. Not that we were the only ones making it, but we're, in this case, us. And but I think that the lack of progress from their perspective of the COP process, the UNFCCC, these kinds of things, despite the IPCC being, even in its watered down summaries for policymakers, increasingly strident in its scientific claims, obviously very well founded. I think that the way that it's played out, perhaps because of the failure of the COP process, but I think actually the COP process is probably a function of this rather than the cause, it's almost like little climate leviathans unfolding, if that makes any sense. So we see, a version of it in the United States in Bionomics. I think absolutely, and I think again, I don't want to speak for Joel, but I bet he would agree with that. We see it happening in Europe, certainly, on the continent, if not in England or Britain. We have these various forces. We have China kind of doing its own thing, but certainly not that different than some of the sort of capitalist structures that have been important to its growth over the last couple of decades. So maybe even a climate leviathan within the heart of China, which is obviously very different than Mao. And of course, we would never want to say that China right now is actually Maoist. This isn't the point. It's like, it's not. So I do think that we're seeing kind of little climate leviathans, and I've been trying to think about why that might be, because I think in this case we may have been wrong,
right?
At least in terms of the pressure toward planetary scale government. And I think there's potentially a few reasons for this. One is, I think even those powerful institutions and to some extent capitalists who take climate change serious enough to think they might actually need to deal with it are very comfortable with the existing nation-state arrangement. They're not interested in having global governance. They like the way that they basically control existing states, and they have a lot more access to power than they would if something emerged at the international level. Yeah. So there's a sort of incumbency there, which I think really matters a lot. I also think, and perhaps I'm granting them too much strategic foresight, but I do think there's probably a lot of people opposed to global scale governance of anything because of the precedent it might set for other things, like migration or debt repayment, or all these other things that might be put at risk. So we don't sign on to global governance on climate because that opens the door for a lot of things. And it wouldn't just be capital that would be concerned about this, it would also be individual nation states. So I think that might be part of the reason that it's unfolding, at least the way it is right now. I don't think that we're entirely like space cadets for imagining that still might happen something like what we pointed at in the future, but it hasn't unfolded, I think, thus far the way that I at least understood us to be suggesting. So in this frame, Bionomics falls right into the climate leviathan thing. And I think we also find, the analysis, the really sharp analysis that I know you're very familiar with of people like Daniela Gabor, Brett Christophers, some other folks like this who've been really diagnosing the kind of bread and butter or meat and potatoes of these processes. Daniela, in particular around the de-risking state and her framework of the way in which it's all carrots and no sticks inside capitalist institutional frameworks. I think this is absolutely happening. And it's also, just as Joel and I would have said, totally thus far meaningless from a climate perspective. We're not getting anywhere yet. Yeah. So Bionomics is a really big deal, I think, from a political economic perspective, but not from a climate one right now. Right. I mean, I hope I can change that statement in a few years. But, well, for one thing, he may not last past November, to state the obvious. Everyone is worried about this, and it'll be very different if he doesn't. I also think that the mix, the unfortunate mix, in my view, of geopolitics and soft climate policy that sort of constitutes the Biden administration's approach through the IRA and the CHIPS Act and these kinds of things is a really unfortunate way to tie climate to these larger, trade war geopolitical posturing that makes the climate dimensions actually quite a bit more fragile than they might otherwise be. And also, it really tests the commitments, the sincerity of the commitments themselves. I mean, if this has to be geopolitically acceptable, or you have to be able to sell it to BlackRock and the other big business players, then in the end, if it starts to not look very good for them, how stable is this arrangement? I have to say that history would tell us not to trust it very much. Yeah. It's not a New Deal. For all the New Deal's problems, it had some amazing achievements, and it's not a New Deal.
And some durability, for sure.
Exactly. So.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting what you point out there as well. There's those tensions, I guess, or contradictions within Bionomics are so interesting, not least from a climate mal perspective, because it so actively positions itself against China, effectively, despite, decarbonization anywhere going to be reliant on sort of Chinese production of solar photovoltaics, for example. But also, I think, obviously, it really is, whether or not it's, effective is another question, but it really is positioning itself around, driving growth, as any sort of capitalist program has to kind of defer those questions around distributive conflict, inequality, all these things. You can kind of get around that if you're promising and delivering growth, I guess. And this is something that sometimes is sort of gestured toward in your work, so apologies for putting you on the spot, but I'm interested to know, is that question of being tethered to this project of growth, both from a political and a kind of material perspective, is that at the heart of why you see sort of capitalism as a system as, incompatible with a sustainable future? Or is that misrepresenting, I guess, why you see those two things as incompatible? I always want to know why people think that capitalism cannot be reconciled, if that's the case. Because there's so many different, I guess, answers.
Right. So the short answer is yes, that's why. I think there are a lot of things that capitalism produces in its structural emanation through the rest of our world, socially, politically, all the ways that you want to describe, that are really regrettable, and that's the kindest way I can put it. But fundamentally, I think, a system that's premised on throughput is a bad plan on a finite planet that's heating up very quickly. But I would also say that it's not just the question of growth, although the question of growth itself kind of decides it in some senses. But it's not just this question of growth. It's also, about a set of political economic structures that are sort of by definition inegalitarian, exploitative often, not for everyone, of course. There are winners, right? There's a reason why the system has persisted. But there are a lot of losers. And the vast majority of them you and I never see in our lives because they live in parts of the world that, the global system is almost indefensible. The levels of poverty and resource extraction, and you could name the litany of problems in the world that are caught up in the way that global capitalism works over the last 150 or 100 years, let's say. Colonialism being one of the more scary dimensions of that. So I do think that capitalism is incompatible with a just and sane and even slightly stable future at the moment. But I also am not naive about its persistence and its ideological hold, even on people who I might think that I know enough to say it's disadvantaging. Not to put words in their mouth, but this is the way I might see it. So I'm not naive about its hold. I do think, however, that there is something really important about calling it out constantly. Like, capitalism is under siege politically in a very explicit way, in a way that it hasn't been in quite a long time in the heart of its power in Europe and North America. With the younger generations, people say, they don't really know what they're talking about. When they say they're anti-capitalist, they really just mean they're sort of Keynesian. And there's some truth to that. But there's also a way in which a popular debate about capitalist social relations is not weird anymore. And that might go back, there's a lot of backlash right now. But I think that's a really important term. We're talking about how we structure our societies. Those are things that are hard to manipulate, of course. But they're also really important to see, even if you can't change them right away. So, I think I see a lot of hope in that, actually, even though some people say it's wishy-washy and meaningless and it's cool or whatever. I don't know, I'd rather that be cool than what used to be cool.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Getting that sweet Wall Street job.
Exactly, yeah.
Here we are. On that point around hope, I guess, I often feel like it's sort of hard to find. People struggle to locate it. Are there any, I guess, seeds or nascent examples of something that might look like a climate X or more concretely that kind of more egalitarian kind of future, one in which political power is organized very differently to how we're familiar with it? Do you see that anywhere, or has anything like that sort of existed in recent history that might be a base to start from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be honest with you, it's the kind of thing that comes up fairly often, and I'm not sure that I have a really good answer, though I do feel quite comfortable with the answer I have, which again, maybe I'm ducking the question. But so, well, you're from Canada as well. You will know that the standard practice in Canada at the moment, and it puts a great deal of ideological, political, and structural weight on them, is to point to Indigenous peoples as the example of the kind of world in which we could live, and the kind of relationship to the land and non-human nature that we could have. And I have no doubt that that is true, but it just doesn't seem to me to be immediately generalizable in a way. Those are cultures that have long-standing relationships with the world, millennia long. That these are folks who have worldviews and worlds that we can't just access and mine for our, how do we make, contemporary New York more like that? Like that seems to me both naive and also kind of a little bit dismissive of the specificities and depth of those cultures. You can't just pull them up by the roots and go, oh, here we are, braiding sweet gas on Wall Street or whatever. Not to knock that book; it's an important book, but so that's the standard, I think, answer, and it's tempting because it is a very different way of living with and for the world, and of course we want to honor that as much as we possibly can. But I actually think that in terms of real examples that aren't cherry picking, folks who literally have dedicated themselves to preserving the land for longer than the rest of us have ever been on the continent. If we don't cherry pick there, then there are pretty few and far examples that I'm aware of. But I'm not super knowledgeable. There's a whole world, and there may be examples out there that we can learn from. I do think in many cases we won't be able to kind of transplant those knowledges or practices to our own worlds very easily, but they can inspire us for sure. And I do think local neighborhood things and all these things, they matter. No one knows, to me, it seems to me that no one right now can claim that the size or scale of a movement suggests its long-term importance.
Sure.
So when someone does mutual aid at a local level or builds, community gardens, and we laugh and we go, oh, well, that'd be great. It's really nice that they do that. I'm actually like, fuck, that's actually quite important. Yeah. They're doing stuff on the ground. Who knows where that'll go? And we don't have a large scale answer or answers at the moment. So let's just keep answering, and we'll see how it goes. I actually think we're in a really tough place, and I would never claim to know what the right way is forward, but I would also never claim to be able to name who we should and shouldn't listen to. Right. As long as obviously we're not going to listen to some assholes, but I mean, of the people who are struggling to try to address this, yeah, I can't imagine feeling the arrogance to be able to say that's worth listening to and that's not. Sure. So I guess I actually am quite hopeful, but I don't know what I'm hopeful of.
Right, that makes sense. So there's no one that you see as sort of like the core agent of political change, because for a lot of people that might be, the trade union movement or some kind of other body like that. But for you, it's a more kind of unknown.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I would say that existing alliances like a trade union movement or other kinds of social movements, or movements that are really locally focused, like Action Jackson or whatever, these kinds of things, those are all super important. And I would never in any way want to say that there's not the roots of something very exciting or already existing something really exciting there. But I would want to say that I can't imagine there's a primary axis around which the organizing or the solidarity building that is necessary for the kinds of worlds we might want to construct, assuming we have the choice. That we can find one or two or just even a small number. I really think it's a much broader based set of political challenges, and I think alliances might emerge where we never anticipated them. And I also don't think there'll be one big movement that all these, we're like a, from American history, the one big union from North American, so North Canada, the United States. I don't think there'll be a version of that. I think some alliances will form, some won't. That's okay.
Yeah.
If people are doing the best they can in the conditions in which they're working, then that's hope. Like that's a good thing.
And on the question of what that kind of future might look like, I think something that's really unusual in the kind of 2x2 that you described, we all love a 2x2, is that one of the axes is obviously capitalism, which you want to sort of contest outright. But one of the other axes is sovereignty, which I think for a lot of people is a less sort of inherently contestable or problematic, depending on your position, idea. A lot of the movements that we maybe have just talked about, people think of, the indigenous kind of land back movement, for example, maybe as a movement of asserting or reclaiming sovereignty in a sense. Mm-hmm. So that was always, I think, for me in reading your work, a kind of surprising use of the word and maybe unusual in, I think, how a lot of us think about this problem. Mm-hmm. We think of it maybe as one of, too little sovereignty for many groups. So how do you understand sovereignty and why do you think it's, as it's sort of on par with capitalism as a political dimension that we need to be thinking about in terms of a radically different politics?
Right. It's a really good question, again.
Again, with Joel.
Right. Yeah, yes, of course, with Joel. Yeah, I would want to be sure to flag,
Sure.
the collective effort. But I think we would both say that when we wrote the book, we really did have a kind of Hobbesian dimension of sovereignty in mind. So in the Hobbes' classical, the description of the sovereign relationship, Leviathan is the sovereign in a sense. And it's very clearly a he, needn't be obviously, but for him it was a he, sort of determines the rules by which games are played. Obedience is owed to Leviathan by his subjects. And in return for the security that comes with the obeisance to Leviathan, he in turn provides a civil realm in which freedom can be exercised in a way that we might think of as kind of market freedom or, I know I'm telling you already, but not everyone, I guess, would be more familiar with this kind of thing. And I think we were really thinking about sovereignty in these frames. So like, the degree to which one subjects oneself to a power, ideally in return for certain kinds of freedoms within the constraints that sovereign sets. And we were imagining sovereignty, therefore, operating at both kind of a nation-state scale, but also, potentially in these sort of more supranational realms that would be necessary to deal with climate change as a global problem because of its so-called market failure dimension or collective action problem dimensions, the sort of standard liberal framing. So sovereignty for us was that, and we were trying to argue that. Well, I think we were trying to argue two things. Firstly, that there was no reason, and the brief political history would suggest there's a lot of reason to be suspect of existing sovereign powers' capacity to get us out of this mess. Like, they're all gathering in Copenhagen and clapping each other on the back, and nothing's coming from it, right? So these are the sovereign powers of the planet. And this is a global problem, and they're like no help at all. And so we were like, well, that's a problem. And then on top of that, I think we were also imagining that many of the kinds of movements would be operating at scales that right now sovereignty doesn't pay any attention to. They don't exist in some senses. People would have to kind of rescale their relationships, not only to their own environments, but with other movements and the solidarities they might build. So in that case, it would also, exempt itself or refuse the sovereign rule. And it would allow for local power, whereas right now local power is always a sub-power, but what if it were substantive? So it was really a refusal of both the authoritarian dimension of this and of the existing scales and ways of thinking about political organization. And that's the main reason that, of course, we were suspicious of the nation state and the sort of Westphalian kind of tradition more generally, is because it's the one that's divided our planet into these zero-sum competitive blocks. And it seems to me, we're in a world in which somehow the right, with a great deal of help from liberals, has produced a world in which the assumption is that politics are a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And the right is very good at constructing zero-sum games that we get caught up in. But there's no reason any of this has to be a zero-sum game. Only if we believe that everyone wants what we've got, you know. So anyway, that's I think what we had in mind with the problem of the sovereign, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I guess it just brings me back to this, and it's a question that I sort of don't have my own answer to, so no problem if you don't. But, you know, is this, just because of, again, this sort of scale and complexity of what we need to coordinate and, you know, where we are in a sort of realpolitik kind of sense, do you see the nation state and that form of sovereignty as, you know, problematic but probably necessary, or something that, because of the kind of contradictions, both politically and sort of materially that it sets up, that it might, you know, kind of be doomed to fail? Do you see a viable future in which that form of sovereignty and political power remains, or in your mind is that kind of an impossibility? Big question, sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think those are important questions. I think I would say my long-term estimation, which is of course, you know, just mine, is that yes, that is an impossibility. This is not how things will end up. But whether we save the world or whether we don't, I think that I don't think that the existing mode of spatio-political organization of the planet will persist in the long run. But I also think that just because I don't want it to doesn't mean it won't for a long time. And we may have to work within its frame. So I would, at the same time, so for example, like I write, as you know, with Alyssa Battistoni, who has, you know, an incredible range of thinking on many of these questions. But she has participated very actively in the work around a Green New Deal, which is something that I think, especially when Joel and I wrote the book, we would imagine ourselves as being quite different then, and, you know, in terms of our political objectives, not undermining, but just different. Now I don't see those projects as nearly so far apart as I once did, but I nonetheless would argue that that's always important work. So the Green New Deal, or the Big Green State, as Daniela Gabor calls it, these are, given where we're at, I would never again want to undermine efforts to realize those things. But I do think, and I would never put either Alyssa or Daniela in this box, but I do think it's crucial to imagine that those aren't like forever solutions.
Sure.
That there needs to be internal critique about how those are unfolding, the kinds of power relationships that it's inscribing. You know, it's one thing to set up the Green New Deal and have it persist. It's another if Trump follows it.
I think that kind of brings me to my last question, which is similar in a way, which is around this idea of, I guess, the durability of things, but particularly capitalism. And the idea that I think there's a sort of open question around, you know, a lot of people think that the climate crisis and sort of biodiversity crisis, it poses sort of an existential threat to capitalism in a way, whereas others might argue that, you know, capitalism exhibits, you know, remarkable kind of resilience and durability. So question to you on, you know, do you think, to borrow from Marx, that capitalism is looking like it might be its own gravedigger? Or is that sort of too naive a position to take? And if so, is there some kind of path you see to an alternative system beyond capitalism?
Yeah. I don't know if I could any longer put faith in the idea that it's its own gravedigger.
Yeah.
Or at least I'd be reluctant to do so, because every other time, you know, as they say, Marxists have correctly predicted 100 of the last 1 revolutions. and there's a way in which that's really true, I think. You know, it's a bit of an overstatement, of course, but I do think that the way beyond the current political economic impasse is the construction of alternatives rather than the destruction of existing ones, if that makes any sense. Partly because I actually don't think that if I'm honest, I actually just, and I may be proven wrong, but I don't think violence is the way out of this. I think there's a lot of people right now who believe it's time to up the stakes, increase the kinds of resistance, and I can fully understand that. And around the question of property, perhaps, or especially corporate property, of course, I actually have quite a bit of sympathy for that position. I'm not too worried about, some massive international conglomerate that owns the water infrastructure in half the developing world getting their stuff torn down. That doesn't trouble me. But I think the prospect of actual physical violence to people who are as bound up, often unwillingly or reluctantly, or feeling just the compulsion in a world that they didn't choose is the fundamentally wrong strategy. And so I think that it's about constructing other ways of doing this. Perhaps that requires breaking off or building separations over the long term, between larger systems of exploitation and injustice and ecological destruction, and constructing alternatives. But I think that has to go hand in hand with any attempt to undermine capitalism or its more robust institutions. And so, in the sense that its own gravedigger, if the story I'm telling is what Marx meant, then yes. But it seems to me quite often that there was a sort of implicit kind of implosion as capitalism kind of ate itself. I think the evidence for that is pretty slim, and maybe it's doing it right now from an environmental perspective. But as you said, it has proven remarkably robust over the centuries. And now we're in a place where military, economic, political power is so concentrated in the hands of so few, and they're so willing to use it so viciously, so quickly, that it's very hard to imagine a lot of prospects that don't say, we're just going to do our own thing. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very optimistic, perfect place to leave it. Geoff Mann, thanks so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you for having me.